All right. And as people are joining in, let me just repeat the instructions once again. This is Abhishek Kumar from Endek Associates. Very, very happy to have partnered with SCI and BASC. BASC Research Foundation, as you know, is a partner organization, and it's a works essentially in the field of power sector reforms and has done some incredible work in that domain. And we have been working together over the last 3 to 4 years. So just quickly, I just want to reiterate some of the house announcements, which is that please keep yourself muted at all points in time. Unmute yourself only when you are speaking. If you have problem if you have a jerky video or something, try and turn off your video and just use your mic to communicate. Now, primarily, there are about 18-19 speakers and about 40 attendees to this call. So request to please observe the rules that were already sent out to you. I'm reading them again. So to avoid cross disturbances, please keep your mic and camera off. The controls will be on your screen. In case your call is disturbed, try and use a mic without the camera. As per the agenda, there are 16 speakers, which include the catalysts as well as discussants, and 4 themes. So what Simran will be doing is he'll be opening up with a PowerPoint presentation, and will have a small PowerPoint presentation in the beginning of each topic discussion, which would then be catalyzed by a catalyst for that particular topic. And after that, we have a discussion that will happen on that particular topic for 15 minutes. Should you have any question, please raise your hand on the screen, on the video screen, and there is also an option on Zoom to raise your hand so that moderators can see and invite you to ask that question. For attendees, we request you to be very pithy, terse, and precise in asking your questions on the chat board only. We will try and invite some of the questions towards the end of the discussion if we still have time left. Now, as you can see with that, we are already about 6 minutes delayed into the call. I am just doing a final recheck before we start and get this rolling. All right, Simran. Hello.
Yes.
Yeah, you can hear me. Shall
Am
we
I
start?
audible? Yes.
All
I
right.
think there's still few more to join, but hopefully they will be joining during the session.
Yes. All right. So thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, for joining in. This is a very important discussion. It can't be more important because the times that we're living in, electricity and power issues going to be very, very critical. As you all know, Electricity Act 2003 is the statutory framework that governs generation, transmission, distribution, trading of electricity. And also, I mean, while keeping in mind the interests at different federal levels. And we have regulators in every state. It's a very complex system of regulation. There's much that's been talked about. There's been much that's been talked about in the context of regulatory reforms to have a better power sector in India. But these conversations have been happening for quite some time. And just as we were discussing, and these conversations have been happening for almost decades now, two issues really stand out. One is and these are recurring issues, that discoms are perpetually in the red. So discom reforms and power sector reforms go hand in hand. So how do you solve that problem? Personally, I feel that there are a lot of discom losses also have to do with externalities. That would mean how we using our water in agriculture, how we, what kind of water conservation and other power conservation technologies do we have in our industries, etc., etc. So there's also a need to look at that. But right now, we will not be focusing on those aspects. The second is that there has been a talk about getting private sector investment in the power sector. So what kind of commercial incentives can be there? This is also a continuing discussion that's been happening. But just as we were discussing these issues, we were hit by COVID. And one of the most important things that, at least to my mind, that comes is that we have stranded capacities as the industry comes back on its feet or is trying to come back on its feet. It would require cheap power. But the fact is that the cost of supply is still quite expensive. So that's a dilemma that we will have to deal with. How do we really provide cheap power at the same time support our industries, but at the same time ensure that our cost of supplying power is not that high. Otherwise, we will not be able to sustainably look at power sector in future. So I'm not going to discuss the amendments in detail right now. Simran is going to be doing it, but just a couple of quick thoughts on that. The timing of these amendments is very, very interesting. So I would also like panelists to also discuss the timing and what the context of these amendments and the timing of these amendments as well. Broadly, they relate to viability of DISCOMs, sanctity of contracts, payment security mechanisms, regulatory regime, and also talks about requisite amendments to the Act to bring out renewable energy policy. And of course, last but not the least, about cross-border energy trade as well. So with that, I would hand it over to my colleague, Simran Grover at BAS Research Foundation, but would like to acknowledge the support of BAS Research Foundation and SAF Foundation in putting this together along with Indic Associates. We are very, very thankful to our partners and very, very thankful to all the participants and the speakers who have joined us today. So with that, let me invite Simran to take the discussion forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Abhishek. I hope I'm audible to everybody. I welcome the seasoned experts and thought leaders who have joined us today. And I thank you for this learning opportunity for public policy practitioners like myself. As an output of this roundtable, we do intend to put forth a joint submission to Ministry of Power with willing stakeholders present today. While I'm confident that today's discussion shall help inform and shape our individual efforts at the same time. We shall, of course, take cognizance of the current realities and demands of the future to derive policy change. But I shall also urge the panelists to apply Chesterton's fence principle, according to which reform should not be made until the reasoning behind existing state of affairs is understood. And this is especially relevant for the power sector in India. Foremost, we need to reflect if the proposed amendments are mere patchwork to address some concerning issues, and if it's time for a new legislation altogether. There are a lot to discuss between the proposed amendments, but we shall be focusing on 4 sessions, starting with the regulatory regime. Some of the most significant amendments proposed are designed to grant more power to appellate bodies, enforce regulatory discipline, especially in setting tariffs, and inhibit an intervention by the state governments. In a definitive shift of decision-making towards the center, multiple selection committees for appointment of respective state electricity regulatory commissions are replaced by a single committee at the center. This committee shall constitute a retired judge or an active judge from Supreme Court, 2 secretary in charge from the center, and 1 chief secretary each from 2 states on rotation basis. In an effort to enforce sanctity of contracts, electricity contract enforcement authority is proposed to be constituted, while affairs concerning regulations and tariff determination shall be strictly within the ambit of regulatory commissions. The amendment also directs the regulatory commissions to determine cost-reflective tariffs with any subsidy to be granted by the state government to be directly transferred to the consumers by the state. With this, I shall invite Mr. VP Raja, former chairman of MERC, who has been active in advocacy and reforms within the sector for many years now. Welcome, Mr. Raja. Please, we'll look forward to hearing the thoughts.
Yes. Thank you, Mr. Simran. A quick, just to remind all of us, the Electricity Act 2003, in a certain sense, was the extension of economic reforms that this country commenced after the balance of payments crisis, and what was started by when Mr. P.V. Narasimha Rao was the Prime Minister and Dr. Manmohan Singh was the Finance Minister in 1991. So the discussion, first we had this Electricity Regulatory Commissions Act 1998, under which some states did set up commissions. Then from 2000 onwards, the first draft of the what ended up as the Electricity Act 2003 started. And there was very wide consultations. I myself in different assignments in government had attended at least 2 consultations at the level of the standing committee headed by Mr. Santosh Mohan Dev at that time. The intention of the act was multifold, which is well summarized in the preamble of the act. But amongst all things, it also wanted more investments into the sector. And investment always meant you need to create faith that and a level playing field. The moment you have multiple players, you need a level playing field and you need a body on which faith can be bestowed by potential investors. And faith can also be bestowed by utilities, consumers, all stakeholders. So that is the background of constituting the State Electricity Regulatory Commissions, the Central Electricity Regulatory Commission. And obviously, a second intention was to change from the integrated system which we had of generation, transmission, and distribution to greater and greater reliance on markets. So this involved unbundling of the erstwhile state electricity boards and separating them out, unbundling it, and basically creating 2 kinds of markets. A wholesale market. In the wholesale market, supply will be everybody who generates electricity, conventional, non-conventional, including renewable, all the generation. And the demand will be obviously the distribution companies, most of which even now continues to be with the government sector, almost 97-98%. A small amount of private sector exists in distribution. So that is the wholesale market. And looking back the last 17 years after the act came into effect, certainly a large amount of investments did take place. The contribution of the private sector in electricity generation has gone up to almost 45, 47, 48% of the total generation capacity today. So that should be considered a success. Of course, there were problems there that coal couldn't keep pace with the amount of investments that was taking place in new generation plants. And today we have this other problem of stressed assets line. There was a second market to be created. And the second market was a retail market. And that is a very major market reform with a stress on competition. But the 2 things, important provisions made in the Electricity Act to bring about this retail market, one was the provision of non-discriminatory open access. Another was progressive reduction of cross subsidies. Now, these are the items. First, you'll remember in the first formulation of the Act, which was passed by Parliament, all these things, the cross subsidy should be progressively brought down and brought down to 0. And then an amendment was made within a year, mostly because of the pressure of the left parties on whom the government was dependent at that time, and this bringing it to zero was deleted. And now, then later through the tariff policy, they said make it at least within plus minus 20% of the cost of supply. But without going into those micro details, these two steps of progressive reduction of cross subsidies and open access, and the two of which are intimately related, really, well, we have not done too well. We have given open access as and when required, depending on particular years. When there is a shortage of supply, there is a demand for a lot of open access. But non-discriminatory open access as a system didn't really, it was ups and downs, has not worked as well as it ought to have. Various attempts were made to push it, including in between that every load which is more than 1 megawatts must necessarily buy through open access from the market. Didn't work, on ground didn't work. Then the last set of proposed amendments, 2014, when the previous avatar of the present government came to power, they brought out a set of amendments which went to the standing committee. It was introduced in Parliament, referred to the standing committee. They gave a report. The main item there was separation of carriage and content. That appears to have been buried. Those set of amendments, which again went through a lot of discussions. And now we have the very recent proposed amendments notified on 17th of April. As far as these amendments are concerned, the first is clearly it is not a game changer. It is incremental in nature. An important thing which has been introduced is so-called Electricity Contract Enforcement Authority, a completely new institution to act as the main body for dispute resolution. This has created a lot of debate. It in a certain sense takes away powers which were with the electricity regulatory commissions and takes it to a central body headed by a judge. Even in today's newspaper, there's an article in the Financial Express saying the same thing can be achieved through the existing arbitration clause under section 158 of the Electricity Act 2003. But I have my own reservations on that also, because I remember while working as chairman MERC, I had occasions, and then I did seek legal advice on what are the matters which the commission should decide and what are the matters which can be sent for arbitration. What I recall is I was basically advised that anything that involves tariff or anything which will impact the consumer directly or indirectly must be dealt with by the commission. The reason is consumer representatives can participate in commission hearings, while in arbitration, they have no part. But if you look carefully into the Electricity Act, if the intention of creating this enforcement authority are to look into power purchase agreements, everything has to do a lot with consumers. Almost 90% of what we do with, including contractual issues, it can't be said the consumers have no interest. So that is one kind of a debate which arises from this. The second thing that comes is, in my opinion, the role of a regulator is different from the role of a judge. Judicial organizations are meant to implement the constitution and the laws. The regulator is expected to be judicial in his application of mind. He is expected to make people feel that whatever is being done is just and fair. Recent orders are to be given. In spite of all that, his job is different because he has to balance the interest of in particular, the consumers and the utilities. While a judicial function does not involve this balancing. And PPAs are also balancing mechanisms. In my own view, PPAs, this is my personal view, the problem we have had with PPAs is we have tried to have this 25-year long-term power purchase agreements. And with hindsight, the simple system of economics is if you try to peg both the quantity to be purchased and the price, you're going to be in trouble because the market is always dynamic. And that is what we have ended up doing when we have this long-term power purchase agreements. We have fixed both quantity and price, which looking back is a serious mistake. I know a lot of contracts, at least abroad. I dealt with in one of my jobs a set of contracts where we were selling illuminate to the United States, some firms, and they always had a clause called meet or release. If the prices of that commodity becomes very volatile, they have the first right to refuse. So if they want the quantity, they will say we will meet the higher price, give it to us, or they will release you from that contract for that particular year. So some kind of a meet or release contract. I think this nature of the PPAs and the contract is what needs to be looked into. It is not contract enforcement, which is the real problem in my view. I think there are a few other points. I don't know how much time I have already taken, but the
right. We can come back to that, sir, Mr. Raja. I'm very intrigued about one of the first things that you started with, which is that the initial intent was to introduce more private sector participation, and to streamline the activities of the power sector. Now, if you speak of the regime, which is what parts that this particular amendment seeks to change, I'm struggling to still understand how these amendments or proposed amendments are going to lead to that. Except to some extent, the selection process, yes, but not completely understood that. Because what I find missing are things like how do you harmonize regulatory practices around the country? You have so many regulators. So what? You don't have certainty in terms of investments, scrutiny of investments. There are no harmonized standards. I mean, that question is still open. So on one,
I like to react to that. At the end of the day, it all depends on the quality of the regulators. Quality in terms of not mere knowledge, but what kind of a human being he is. He must be well trained in law, in economics, in finance, in the intricacies and the technical matters of electricity. But more than all that, he must be a just and fair person. I think what happens with a number of regulatory commissions, I'm not finding fault with any individual, is that knowingly or unknowingly, a regulatory capture takes place either by the DISCOM or more often by the state governments when it comes to SCRCs. Because whether one likes it or not, the government controls the regulator not merely through the judicial areas, but through administrative areas. Many regulatory commissions depend on funding on the state government. Luckily, MERC had independent funds. But I know many commissions, if they don't get grants from the government, they may not be able to pay salaries. So I think regulatory capture is a major issue. So, and a lot of problems on contracts, non-compliance of PPAs are not merely because of regulators going wrong. It has all to do with the political economy.
Sure. I think that's fairly understandable point, but exactly the point is that these are the problems that we've known. I don't see these amendments addressing any of those problems structurally. Let me bring in here Mr. Pendse. Mr. Pendse, would you like to reflect on the core questions here? Mr. Pendse? I don't think he can hear us. Okay, can I turn to Mr. Tabrez, Malawat? Am I audible? I'm not sure if I'm not getting any response.
You are audible.
Hi.
Hi, is that Mr. Tabrez?
Yes, Tabrez this side.
So I'm just reiterating the question. So the timing of the amendments seem to be of essence over here. At the same time, we have a situation. If you do a plain, simple reading and some shallow analysis of the amendments, I don't know what others have to say. This is particularly my own feeling, and that we have still not been able to connect where do we want to go. I mean, first of all, it's not very clear with these amendments the direction that we want to take. The second question is, even if we were to be clear, and some people are saying that it is to enhance greater private sector participation, I don't quite see how the regulatory regime, the amendments proposed in the regulatory regime, are going to be able to handle that. We're still missing the target by quite some distance. So, Mr. Tabrez, would you want to quickly react? And then let me also bring in Mr. Gopal Jain, Advocate, Supreme Court of India, to reflect on these propositions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Abhishek. You see, most of the points that has been brought out by Mr. Raja, I don't find any difficulty in agreeing with him. To be very honest, if you see the purport and the objective statement also, there are several procedural and other aspects which has been taken care in the amendment. For example, if we see the enforcement agency that has been proposed, the contract enforcement agencies, what we have seen recently, if we go by the pragmatic things what are happening on the ground, there are several state governments, after there being a change of regime, has started or compelled the generators to renegotiate contracts. One thing. Second thing is that there's a lot of pressures on the state regulatory commissions, and they are not being able to devote time on the contract related issues. Therefore, there was a need for a quick resolve of problems and the disputes arising with the contract. And in an economics, if we see, there's a more important principle of signaling. Something have to be signaled very fast in a very clear terms and in certain manner, so that enables investment happening. This is one of the mechanism. If you see the functions that have been given to the enforcement agency, they are very much towards the point that the contracts today needs to be adhered. You can't just move out of the contract, and if you go away, there would be an authority behind that who would be seeking enforcement of it. And for if you see all ease of doing rankings and everything, even the contract enforcement mechanism and the how good is the judicial setups with respect to enforcement of contract, in that ranking they also get some kind of points. So this is a very critical aspect of ease of doing business, that there is an authority which is specifically there in this sector who is going to enforce contract. And if you see, if you see it from the perspective of a businessman, if someone has invested $1 million or or $500,000 in building a plant, and his revenues are not secured, for example, we have a payment security mechanism in place that will ensure that the payments would be paid out. Then contracts which are signed in order to protect the investment, those contracts are going to be very much abided by the distribution companies. So at the end, the investor would be seeking a mechanism where his investment is secured. And I think these kind of initiatives taken in the draft amendment, particularly the payment security mechanism and a separate authority who would be there to enforce contract, this is very, very critical. If you see it from a private player perspective, they have been facing problem day in day out because their contracts were not being given as much dominance, or if you say that the required attention, they were not getting that. And also if we see the change in the selection process and everything, there are many commissions. If you see, have been defunct from last 6 months, 8 months, because there were no judicial members, there were no proper quorum, and things were just lying over there. Therefore, in order to bring uniformity and to quick start the process, they have limited time periods, that before someone gets superannuated, there would be an appointment happening. This is a particular time within that state and central government has to do, and to make a reference for the selection of the member. So
Right.
they're very critical in that aspect.
Right.
And to be very honest, being a lawyer, I've seen generators getting suffered because of these issues, and they have been thinking of moving out from the sector. At the end, you have to enable someone and ensure his confidence remain there. So these kind of things would obviously going to boost up their confidence and incentivize them to remain in the sector or to put more money. There's so many promoters we have seen that they've installed a project, but they're not inclined to have even second unit of it, because they see a lot of problem with respect to the recovery of the money and all.
Tabrez ji, I also have to, I'm sure, I also have to keep time. Let me just bring Gopal ji.
I'll just put a last comment on it. I'm sorry for that. Mr. Raja has highlighted about a meet and release clause. So in one of the PPA, I'll tell you, we have put up a exit clause that if a tariff is not been agreeable to the parties, it's a 62 tariff determination procedure. Either of the parties has a right to move out of the PPA. You won't believe we face so much fierce, opposition from the regulator, despite his not having jurisdiction over the issue. That no, we don't want to have these kind of clauses, and that the issue is stuck in the court proceedings for last 2 years, and the person who have made investment, he's not been able to get even through the process of tariff determination.
Yeah. Thank you. Thanks for bringing them up. Let me just bring Gopalji. Gopalji, of course, you've heard the comments. 2 specific questions to you. What is the direction that you see with these amendments? Where are we headed? The second is the constitutional validity of taking out powers from the regulator and trying to centralize them.
Thank you very much. I think we can take it for granted that it was time to revisit the Electricity Act 2003. And therefore, it's quite clear that there was a need to boost the function of the power sector, to promote clean energy, bring about reform and change, to incentivize investments, have sound tariff policies. So all that is a given. I specifically want to focus on the question that you put to me on the new authority. But before I do that, I want to set the context. If you step back and see what is our track record on sanctity of contracts, this is not just in the electricity sector. This is a major chronic problem we have. And you probably know that while India has gone up in the ease of business ranking of the World Bank, but sanctity of contract, India remains among the abysmally poor, in the lowest of the low range. So merely bringing about a new authority, according to me, would not necessarily mean that contracts are going to be enforced. Second, I want to give an example. We have the Contract Act, and it's the public policy of India that contracts, the integrity and sanctity of contracts must be met. But it's more in their breach than in their performance, because the mindset in India is to introduce some kind of equity into the decision-making process. Now, we came up with the Commercial Courts Act in 2017. That was supposed to deal with commercial issues, but it was still housed in the same civil court, quote-unquote, premises, so the culture was the same. Now, traditionally, when you look at the initial PPAs, for example, at the time of Enron, they all had English law provisions. And the point was, under English law, they scrupulously adhere to the sanctity of contracts. It's a culture of discipline, a culture of enforcement. It's a commercial decision-making mindset. So I think the single most important thing, if you want to fix this issue, is not whether it's the commission or whether it's a new authority or whether it's arbitration. You need to have a commercial environment of decision-making. You ensure that contracts are well negotiated, they have fair and reasonable terms. But when it comes to enforcement, the most important aspect is read the framework of the contract and give effect to it. Simple things like payment by discoms to Gencos has become such a full-blown problem that the dues are over 90,000 crores, looks more like an NPA figure. And we saw companies like Bhushan and SR, I mean, their dues were in a significant range. So I think the need of the hour is really, according to me, have commercial online dispute resolution, get decision makers who are not necessarily legal or judicially minded, but who are economically, commercially, and financially minded. If you create a culture which is a cultural environment of commerciality, looking at the commercial deal, looking at the business side of it, the finance side of it, then and only then, according to me, can this be resolved. And secondly, as a sequel to this, I say that in the enactment, we create an expert body called a regulator. Then you have an appellate body. The appellate body has technical members. And then on top of it, you have the Supreme Court, which has no expertise in these matters, but an appeal lies there. So a decision of experts is ultimately looked at by brackets open, not experts in the field. So I think the whole regulatory appellate body architecture and landscape has to be customized to the needs of a sector, particularly like the electricity sector, where there are so many commissions, there are no standardizations, there are no protocols, and then you centralize everything in the appellate body and then a second appellate body, which is supposed to look at it. So I think this whole thing requires systemic rethinking. And if you have experts, then it must be experts all the way through. If you want commercial or monetary disputes to be decided, perhaps it's time that we go to arbitration, because now the arbitration process has been streamlined, made time bound. So I think this is what requires far more debate and discussion. If you want to really address the problem of payment by discoms and sanctity of contracts and payment security mechanisms, versus you can have any authority, but if the discoms don't comply or don't follow, or that you have a decree which is not being enforced, then we are back to square one. So practical, pragmatic, and commercial wisdom in the creation of any body, which, as I said, has commercial decision making and commercial sense at the heart of it, is perhaps what I think would be the solution or a resolution to this issue. Thank you.
Thank you,
I
Gopal.
think I'd like to intervene. I broadly agree with Gopal, who has made these points. The trouble that comes is that 97% are state discoms. And when state discoms are one of the parties, there is this entire gamut of the Central Vigilance Commission. It is not that in a commercial fashion, a deal can be struck, which is best on both sides. People in state discoms are literally prevented from doing that. They're forced to take a narrow judicial view. So unbundling of the state discoms, or rather making it real corporates with reduced government ownership, is a prerequisite before Mr. Gopal's suggestions can work. But I agree with his suggestions.
Sir, yeah, points well taken. The problem is where to start. Why would a private investment come into a bleeding discom? I mean, and I think what Mr. Gopal is also suggesting is to go and have a more systemic diagnostics of the whole situation, rather than just creating in an agency and relying on that agency to sort out the system. This is just not a power sector problem. It seems
Abhishek, I just want to come in for a minute. Years ago, there was a dispute on mutual funds, whether it is to be decided by SEBI or IRDA. Instead of just deciding whose turf it lies in and putting a jurisdictional Lakshman Rekha, they created another body on top of it to decide. If you don't have the contours of the law defined, then the new body, like it happened in electricity with interstate generation, whether it be CRC or state, why have turf war and jurisdiction battles? Investors want a return. If their money is stuck, they go to authority. It should be settled and decided. So let's not leave anything open-ended in creating friction between a regulatory commission and a new body, which is inevitable because you're taking away something and giving it to somebody else. So a new system of authority enters an occupied field. So I'm saying let's not go down that path at all, and let's make something which will have effective from an investor, a Genco point of view, if the money is to come to them. And the payment security mechanism and enforcement must, like an English court decree or award, must result in the fruits. So they want to see the fruits at the end. You don't want to be caught between one or the other authority.
right. Well,
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah. Thank you,
Yeah.
sir. Mr. Pendse
Yeah.
is here. Mr. Pendse, also
Yeah.
just request
Yeah.
all speakers to briefly introduce yourselves because others
Yeah.
may not know.
Yeah.
And
Yeah, my name is Ashok Pendse. I have been working with Regulatory Commission for almost last 20 years as consumer representative. There are 2 points as Mr. Raja and the gentleman said, that we had regulatory commissions which are functioning for 17 years. Now, if we are not in a position to achieve the result via regulatory commission, then improve them. Why are we trying to create one more body? This is the first point. Then let me go to the second point. See, what they are saying is this is a dispute resolution. Even after dispute resolution, the crux of the issue goes to what is at the end of the dispute resolution, there has to be some financial impact, and this financial impact will go in the area of tariff. So that means they will have to once again go to the regulatory commission. Let's take 2 quick examples. In respect of Punjab, when the contract said that it should be the coal supply is the responsibility of the government, and then the issue came of the wash coal. The issue went right up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said wash coal has to be given. Okay, the idea has been given as far as the Supreme Court is concerned, but now once again doing all the calculations of the previous year and for the future years goes to the regulatory commission. This is the second part of it. So that means the dispute resolution doesn't stop. Dispute resolution has a financial impact, and that goes to the tariff, and that tariff once again goes to the regulatory commission. So we have introduced one more stage. Rather than all being decided by the regulatory commission, you have got dispute resolution, go to regulatory commission for tariff, and then once again go to DISCOM. The crux of the issue, whether it is contracts, whether it should be observed, etc., is not the issue. All these years in the earlier part, the majority of the thing were via only 2. That means the central sector and the state sector. Then it was with the state and the central sector power being purchased. Nobody was bothered what happens whether we pay or we don't pay. The crux came when the independent power producers came. So there is a clear division, independent power producer and rest with the whether it is the central or state government. Now the issue is that let's say that the contract must be observed, the financial what should be the amount should be paid, etc., also has been decided, everything accepted. The crux of the issue, where is that money with the DISCOM in their pocket? In a progressive state like Maharashtra, year after year, not 1 year, year after year, even now, with respect to the ARR, the total around 10 to 12% of the billed amount is not recovered, which comes into the 4 basic segments. One is agricultural consumption, not money being paid. 2, the number of pockets are there in a state which do not pay, where the collection efficiency can be as bad as 60 to 63%. 3, public water works and street lighting. And the 4th, the government like could be a commissioner of police office, maybe a civil hospital, maybe a collector office, etc. They don't pay, and this is the hit to nobody else but to the generator. Contracts accepted, I'm very noble, everything accepted, you should pay me, accepted, absolutely accepted. There is the money in the DISCOM's pocket. Unless and until we improve the DISCOM's pocket, this will have only theoretical value. Otherwise, that contract, it should be a British contract, if we have not negotiated, etc., is okay. There is
Right.
the money in the DISCOM's pocket is the crux of the issue, and this is not for today. For the last 21 years that I am seeing, I have not seen even 1 year where it is there.
Right. I think that's a perfect point to segue into the next session. I do have a couple of more speakers here who I wanted to invite into the regulatory discussion, but we will come back to it because we are already over time. May I request Simran to get into the distribution side of it? Is Mr. Tongia here, Simran?
Yes, I think he's here. Hi, Rahul.
Yeah, Simran, yeah.
Hi.
Hey Rahul, I did have an introduction prepared, but in the interest of saving time, I like to hand it over directly to you. Please welcome Rahul Tongia from Brookings, India.
Thanks.
Over to you, Rahul.
Thanks. How much time should I take? 2 minutes, 5 minutes, 15?
5 minutes.
5 is a fair, I guess.
Okay, so it'll be compressed. We just held a webinar last week. Some of you may have seen it on DISCOMs post-COVID. So obviously COVID changes some things, but it also in some ways emphasizes this challenge of short-term needs that we're going to see versus long-term problems, because the DISCOMs have been called the weakest link in the electricity chain. So I start with this sort of query that what is the problem you're trying to solve with legislation? And the Electricity Act 2003, it's now 17 years old. Amendments have been tried in 2015, 2018, 19, and now we have a third avatar, which is less ambitious, which some people have liked. It doesn't have, for example, the headline, which is carriage and content separation. It has walked away from that. But the larger question is, it's a little bit underwhelming as well, because legislation is meant for bigger change as opposed to notification, regulation. And there's also a bunch of gray area where things like the tariff policy are alluded to, or other acts like new renewable policies, but they're not spelled out. So the tariff policy also then gains legislative sanction without being legislated or deliberated at a legislative level. It's in some ways, unfortunately, very little of this amendments, not enough, I wouldn't say very little, are major changes. There are more tweaks. Some are changes like on the subsidies. I'll get to that in a second. And I come back to this starting point, what Mr. Raja had even said, what is the problem you're trying to solve? The first act was really geared towards capital. Generation came first, not the DISCOMs being broken up, which started in fact in 98, 99. And it was also trying to get foreign capital because domestic capital was short. So 8 IPPs were actually given sovereign counter guarantees. Only 2 of them actually ever produced power. So the larger question that some of this act focuses on is new tweaks to do allocations of risk, which may help free up capital. But the largest issue is this is a non-equal playing field. Generation is much of the cost of a DISCOM, but within generation, there are huge variances, not based on efficiency, but based on structural reasons, locational, public-private, fuel type. There are structural differences between these. And for any attempt that gets said, well, we want to evolve towards a market system, you have to be very cautious which market design you're talking about, because you cannot have retail competition without wholesale. And we cannot have wholesale without fuel liberalization as well. The focus in this act seems to be less on the DISCOMs other than the subsidy side and a few aspects. But for example, this new entity, this new authority that will look at contracts, it's like we're creating a new rule. Thou must follow the rules. Like the earlier speakers had said, we already have contract law, we already have appeals, we already have APTEL and going up, but yet those are not used properly. And let's not forget something that Mr. Raja and others have said. The biggest stakeholder in all of this is the government. So do we really see this new entity saying, well, this government needs to be pulled up? That's been the missing link. The largest defaulter to the DISCOMs, not just of O's, but also of subsidies, not as a consumer only, but also of subsidies, is the DISCOM and the state governments. So who pulls them up? That is a major elephant in the room that we are dancing around only up to this date. So we'll have a paper, it should be out within an hour on our Brookings website on this issue of DISCOMs post-COVID, but also the long-term issues. The older act had a lot of things that weren't implemented. So tariff subsidies were supposed, cross subsidies were supposed to go away to 20% then. And then instead of going away, it became 20%. We don't even have DISCOMs at 20% yet. And so now it's maybe, are we just doubling down like a gambler who instead of recognizing what are the underlying issues that prevent us from doing what many people think we should do? The largest sort of takeaway from this act, in my view, is this is focusing a lot on tweaks or improvements or problems instead of being forward looking to enable things that are the future problems, which isn't just lack of capacity or lack of supply. We've solved that problem. Or even making sure payments as promised or should have been happen as they are. But renewables, third parties, storage, technology-based shift, disruption from the edge, none of these are properly enabled. It took executive orders to allow electric vehicles to be charged by third-party providers who would not require licensing. But we are dancing around so many of these issues, where at one level they help technologies or environment or new disruption, but at the same time we're protecting against disruption. So that balancing act, that needle has not been threaded. The last few points related to DISCOMs purchasing, I won't talk about central state, which others have. DBT, subsidies. So there is a distinction between subsidies and cross subsidies, which is not as articulated well enough. And DBT has enormous problems. It is not a magic solution. It isn't the only instrument which can free the DISCOMs out of, you know, this Gordian knot of subsidies. But even if you went for DBT, it's not clear that the poorest of the poor would be the beneficiaries, not because they don't have Aadhaar or they don't get the DBT alone, but also look at how your subsidies are often put in. Delhi's subsidies are very high for electricity, but they're also effectively going to the owner of the connection, not the tenant, not the, in farming, 55% of farmers at one point were laborers. They don't own the land. So it's actually about 15-18% of the farmers who actually get the benefit of cheap or free power. And then they often sell water. So these are all the larger things that I hope need deliberation as well. Thank you.
I will say extremely well said. The entire issue, one way or the other, of DISCOMs is an issue of the political economy of the state. Is the state government part of the solution, or sometimes part of the solution and sometimes part of the problem?
So I'll just have one quick rejoinder, Rahul. As I was saying, I was muted. I didn't realize. I was listening to you a couple of days back in your webinar, and I think it was Mr. Pradhan, or I think you spoke about it. Is the fact that there is no reason why private investment can't come or things can't become better at DISCOM level, because it is essentially a cash business. So if you price things right, you are going to get a lot out of the sector. Now, even if you consider that DBT may have their inherent issues, but considering that those issues will get resolved, do you see DBT could actually nudging DISCOM financing in some way or the other?
I think, again, let's get separate theory versus practice. You know, it certainly could. The theory is not only helpful, but the underlying implications are also helpful. So you would incentivize efficiency. If I give power for free, pump sets are inefficient. Delhi's subsidy of 400 units is so damn high that 86% of people are getting it, 91% 6 months a year. And now I have no incentive to save power. The newest avatar of Delhi subsidies, unlike the first round, which was 50% subsidy, is actually zero bill up to 800 rupees effectively. And so if I'm consuming 100 units, I have no incentive not to use 150 units. So this mechanism of getting the price signals right is, to me, absolutely spot on. But that is a larger challenge of why aren't we doing it that way, which has less to do about DBT. You could still have direct subsidies to go to the DISCOM instead of through DBT. It's a separate route. There's other routes available as well. But the larger question is, if you do make it to the end user, and now states don't pay, they're not paying today. So why do we really expect them to pay on time to a guy who has no voice often? And there'll be loopholes upon loopholes said ki nahi, this is your problem, we tried, look, I've got the platform, people aren't showing up, it's their fault, their problem, etc. Until we address The larger systemic issues, it's not clear that you can rely on DBT alone unless you get all your homework done right. Your secondary mechanisms, and this comes back to the regulator that has been there before. In this paper, that will be out in an hour, we asked this question. Let's say there's a target of AT&C loss reduction, and the DISCOM doesn't do it. Not because they're idiots, not because they don't want to, but it's an overly ambitious target. It's just something that's not practical. Just like a certain quantum of DBT isn't practical in the current or even historical fiscal future. Forget post-COVID per se. So how do we adapt? We compromise through shell games, delayed payments, revolving, and all of these things. So either we need to head on get clean with our accounts, accounting and incentives and payments, fixed versus variable costs, all of the above. It's very hard to just fix a little bit of this. So the question that I'm posing in that paper is, let's say something doesn't go as planned. Either DBT doesn't show up on time, or the AT&C loss didn't happen for whatever reason because it was too ambitious, frankly. Then what? Are you going to shut them off? Are you going to tell the DISCOM, bhaiya, aapko no more supply, you're not going to allowed to be buying from any generator? Will I cut off those 10% people, farmers or whoever, not just agriculture but households who didn't pay their bill, and they'll say, bhaiya, it's not my fault that the DBT didn't show up on time. Now what?
Right.
Can I interrupt for a minute? I wanted to share some data. See, the whole crux what we are talking about is, one of the major problem as far as the subsidy is concerned, state governments are not paying. Let me share about 6 states. Now, as far as the Maharashtra is concerned, the amount of subsidy being given is equal to 7%. This is about 1890 data, not last year, about 1 year data back. Maharashtra has got 7% of ARRs equal to subsidy. As far as Gujarat is concerned, it is 12%. Haryana, Punjab, it is 20 to 24%, and Bihar is 33%. Leave Bihar on one end. Let's go to Maharashtra and Gujarat. Maharashtra government is paying subsidy to the DISCOM on a monthly basis. Taxes and duties which are corrected every month are going towards that, and at the end of it, some correction is there. Now, if the government of Maharashtra is paying to DISCOM the subsidy, even then why the DISCOM is failing in paying to the generators? The issue is let's try to take one simple example. We have got 3,200 crores of amount to be recovered from the residential consumers in less than 300 units. I do not want to name the cities. There are cities in Maharashtra where the collection efficiency is 63%. Now, is it possible for us to disconnect them? I don't know. Let's look at, I'll give 2 specific examples of Maharashtra. Now, let's look at Maharashtra's 44 lakh agricultural consumers. 7 rupees the average cost of power, 1 rupee 50 paisa we charge them. 4,800 crore is the gross bill. For last 7 years, we have not been in a position to collect more than 300 crores from them. So always, and year after year, 4,500 crore is shortfall. Let us assume that that the agriculturist is given those 2 rupees that government is giving and 3 rupees 50 paisa. Will he now, since whether comes or not come, when even at 1 rupee 50 paisa he is not paying, will he pay 3 rupees 50 paisa? And do we have the guts to disconnect 44 lakh consumers? The answer is just simply no. This is the second part. Third part of it is, even let's try to go to even one more thing that is coming to our knowledge. What we have done, we have got solar feeders. Now, this is a new thing which we have done, whereby during the day, we have been in a position to give power to those about 12 or 15 feeders which came in September or October or so. So, which is equal to about some 24 megawatt or so. So, that means they have got power at 1 rupee 50 paisa. They have got power during the day, not at night. So, they get convenience. Are those 12 feeder people paying? The answer is no. So the crux of the issue is not necessarily all the time depending upon the state. the subsidy amount. And as the earlier speaker mentioned, the subsidy, even if you go via DBT, will go to the name in which the electricity bill stands, not the actual user, which is the problem. So what we are trying to say is it is not the subsidy amount that is the problem, because in Maharashtra, Gujarat, the governments are paying, but even then the high discoms are not paying. So what we are saying, he's the culprit, let's kill him. The answer is no. It could be in Bihar, maybe 33%, but not with 7%, not with 12%.
Mr. Pendse, point very well taken. I have just a couple of speakers in this particular session. We're slightly running out of time, so I have to keep the time. I'm sorry for that. I would love to hear you out otherwise, but you can all the speakers who have additional points can write into us so that we can incorporate that in the reporting. Let me just bring in Mr. A.K. Bhora, who is a former MD of JBVNL, to put his rejoinder to the things that have been said in the context of discoms.
Sorry, can I just make a small point, Abhishek, before? Sorry. Can
Who's
you
this?
share, Rahul?
Rahul, right there.
Can you
sorry.
first just let us know what you'll be attributing or how you're doing, because we are also directly writing to the government. So we want to be sure that this isn't muddling that message or anything going on. Or for my particular sake, if you want to use something, if you could just please let me know what you want to attribute or share. That will just be helpful for ensuring long-term value.
Absolutely. We will take care. What we will do is that once we have the larger sense that is emanating out of it, we will circulate. That, and should you feel that this is something you disagree or agree, please do point that out also, so that we are very, very clear on how we're taking this forward.
Hello.
Right.
Good afternoon. This is A.K. Bora, former MD Jaipur Discom. See, I have only 4 points to be mentioned. Number 1, related to the distribution sub-licensee. See, already there is a provision for the franchisee to operate, and now this is a confusing point coming in, that there will be a sub-licensee with the approval of the commission. Earlier it was with the information of the commission, distribution licensee, existing licensee can introduce a franchisee. And if you read the proposal, both the provisions are very similar, that ultimately the distribution licensee will be responsible for the acts and operations of the either it is a sub-licensee or it is a franchisee. So it is totally unclear that what is the meaning for bringing in this distribution sub-licensee thing in between. Maybe that it is related to that they want to give the powers to a distribution sub-licensee to have its own open access or source of the power, but it is not clear from the existing provisions. So, or maybe related to some company matters which they wanted to handle here, but it is not clear. Number 2, I would like to say ECEA. Now, this is another body they have introduced for the contract dispute resolving, but it is a sub-court of the APTEL. According to the provisions, it will be act as a sub-court of the APTEL. Its decision is challengeable in the APTEL. Then that means that we are unnecessarily it is we are making it lethargy in the decision making, because then first is that this ECA decision, then after APTEL decision, or in between maybe that some arbitrator will be there, and then Supreme Court. So issue is not going to be settled early, and by that time the very sanctity of the existing PPA will lost, and the repercussion will be too high. So this is another point. Third point is that they are saying that for all the matters, the tariff policy has to be followed by the state commission. Now, tariff policy is framed by the MOP under the Act. And here, what is now transpired from this proposal, that the tariff policy is superseding the act and making it mandatory for the regulatory commission to follow. So earlier it was a guiding factor, and it is to be cleared from the that it needs a clearance from the now that whether the regulator can apply his mind for setting up the tariff with regard to the cross subsidy and this thing. So this is another, and then I would like to add upon
Mr. Gora,
yeah.
no, you can come back in later on.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
No, we have two more sessions, but I'm changing the order of the sessions. We will have one session on the consumer, right? We will give consumer space towards the end. Let's see the reaction from consumer organizations. But I like to bring in renewables so that you can have a comprehensive sense from consumers towards the end of this discussion. So basic question, and we're skipping the slide in the interest of time. Basic question as we segue into the renewables. First, why do you need a amendment to bring out an energy policy and decide on new RPOs when we have already been doing that? That's number one. The question number two is, what is the future of renewables in the context that we are in currently? And I'm talking about post-COVID context, because you already have surplus capacity. And why would, so in that sense, where is the future of renewables in that context? The third addendum to that question is, between the large scale and decentralized, where do you see greater focus, greater traction coming in the days to come? Thank you. Disha, floor is yours.
Hi, Abhishek. Very quickly, just want to make a one-line comment. So in the introduction of the Electricity Act, it lays the directive principle of for environmentally benign policies. I believe it is time for a more aggressive commitments in terms of defining objectives, and if the panel can reflect on that also. So it goes more than renewables. I think we do need to look at overall emissions of the sector and dealing with aging assets, thermal assets.
Yeah. Thank you, Simran. Thank you, Abhishek. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Abhishek and Simran, for providing me an opportunity to be part of this discussion. I am Disha. I work at the Council on Energy, Environment and Water as part of the renewables team. The Council is one of South Asia's leading policy research institutions. And I would, without taking any further time, I'd like to share with everyone that internally at CEW, we've been reviewing the proposed amendments and putting together a set of recommendations based on our research efforts and understanding about the sector. And I would like to take this opportunity to share some thoughts on how the Electricity Act amendment could enable a faster transition to renewables, clean energy, which I think the current draft seems to fall short of doing. While it does have the potential to improve the attractiveness of the sector to investors or improve the performance, the propositions right now have the potential to do so, but like the other speakers also said, quite a bit of definition and clarity would be required. Where I would like to begin would be using this opportunity to amend the Electricity Act. I think we are at this point in juncture that the statement of purpose or the preamble to the Act should very clearly emphasize on the strategic importance of renewables and like new, clean, efficient technologies and solutions, trying to place on record the kind of the energy security, sustainability, growth, and socio-economic development goals that the country has, and how renewables and clean energy can accelerate the pace of meeting those goals. Is, I feel, it's essential to have that kind of consideration being placed, considering RE like as the main occupant of the house, and working rest of the system around it. So I feel that the current amendments are not quite doing that, and there is an opportunity to think on those lines. At the very basic, I even don't find the the amendments including the definition of renewable sources of energy or distributed energy resources, or even on the consumer side, right to produce electricity at their own premises, or right to choose um, sources of electricity. That's something which is must be, must be looked at, and different sections of the act must then see what could be the provisions regarding promotion of these different segments. Very quickly on the tariff determination principles again, I think that we must add metrics like environmental impact reduction or emission reduction, factoring economic costs. So like Rahul was saying earlier, there's so much of distortion in the wholesale pricing, retail pricing. So trying to come up with the metrics which might not be applicable right away, but at least having that kind of an acknowledgement and a metrics gives you a kind of a phased out approach of how actually will you transition from the current regime to the next phase or the next set of regime. I mean, I know the RE policy is being defined there. I still feel there is merit to bring that on, but provided its scope, objective, the development and review process, or have certain things, which is right now also, I mean, the intent under the national tariff policy was to align states to, for example, say reduce cross subsidies by a certain trajectory, but that doesn't happen that way. So the RE policy mechanism, how it should work, is to not, it's to more like bring along states with the center. So there might be some kind of mechanism that should be explored, how to better achieve alignment between the center and the states. So that probably on the policy sides, there's more clarity or more specificity required in the act itself at this stage itself. Very important from the point of view of planning for the future, and this again some previous speakers have alluded to, planning for the future build out and enforcing a bottom-up approach, and institutional roles, responsibilities and functions to do so for integrated energy resource planning, generation, transmission, distribution. Of course, consumers also being vital part of the system. So accounting for all the supply and demand side resources and based on true cost. So like I said, it might be difficult to look at it that way today, but just acknowledging that those costs are there might be a helpful way to start with. So why not look at the key institutions that are there in the sector today? So we CEA, we have the National Load Dispatch Center, we have the CERC, trying to just revisit and redefine the institutional roles and responsibilities, I feel, are non-negotiable, given that we're standing at this cusp of changing consumer preferences and just a paradigm shift on how we've generated, transmitted and distributed electricity. I think it's important that this kind of planning exercise happens in coordination between these institutions being coordinated, and therefore that kind of a process informs the national target setting exercise, and also informs the kind of subsidy and taxation regime that we have currently in place. So what I feel is re-looking at the institutional roles, responsibilities, duties, performance of standards for these institutions, like CA doing a bottom-up process for integrated planning, NLDC assuming greater responsibilities, say for example, monitoring curtailment and analyzing the reasons for it, recommending to the states of how they can reduce the level of curtailment, taking greater roles on scheduling and balancing. Probably maybe the LDCs should be taking greater responsibility or should be authorized to say sell or buy electricity to operate ancillary services markets, or alternatively maybe a greater coordination between the NLDC and the power exchanges to be able to operate the ancillary services market. So some of these added roles and responsibilities which will have to be played, which are not being played so far, is very, very essential. So I'll stop at that. And
Thank you, Disha. Let me just invite Kushagra, who SunSource Energy, and then Aditya Ramji from Mahindra and Mahindra.
Hi, thank you. Yeah. So thank you. This is Kushagra. So very interesting points which have been made earlier, and special thanks to Mr. Raja's views which have come in and across the board. So I think everyone has a perspective. From our perspective as a solar developer, what we like about is a perspective of the Contract Enforcement Authority. Even though it's has to get formed, the details will have to be figured out in perspective. It's gonna be in the same manner it has been proposed, or will there be any modifications? But if we look at from a perspective that a body of such stature is going to be formed, it is definitely going to have will be providing investor confidence in deploying more and more renewables. Number one, because that's where we are coming in from, or a particular, or in particular, or in general, the power projects deployment that is there. MNRE has also been talking about providing, along with the bill, although it is not there yet, the trajectory for the RPOs for the net up to 2030. If that comes in, then probably that will kickstart another larger market of maybe 3,000 to 5,000 megawatts to satisfy that RPO market. So I think that details have to come in. But in addition, overall, we welcome this proposed amendment, and it is much steps forward than what is currently there. And disputes like what has happened in Andhra recently, where the central state issues had happened, and because of which a lot of power developers, including a lot of renewable developers, have suffered, and because of which the country has seen the stalled of the investment coming in. Hopefully those issues are going to go away, although it has to be seen. But we see it as a very welcome step in the right direction to boost the investor confidence.
Thank you, Kushagra. We're running out of time, so I will really ask you to be very, very economical with your words. Aditya, then Rahul, quickly your rejoinders on this particular point before we start the last session, and the final comments is after that. Thank you.
Thanks, Abhishek. I think Disha put a lot of the finer points really well. So I'll just maybe make 2 or 3 pointers, right? One, when I was going through this, I felt that you rightly mentioned, we've already talked of a renewable energy policy, etc. So I think the question, and maybe the lawyers can answer this better, is will this inclusion under the act per se give it some more of a legal framework for implementation of such policies, making both state and center more accountable to actually implementing some of these things. And maybe if I were to go a step beyond, could be a bold step in conjunction with emissions targets, etc., that we may want to achieve. And maybe if in my mind, instead of a national renewable energy policy, it could have actually been a national energy transition plan, which could actually take into account a lot more things beyond renewables, including other technologies, storage, etc. And all of these policies lie in different places, half attempted here and there. So, just to use an analogy, we used to talk about vehicle to grid or vehicle to X in the mobility sector. I think we could have used maybe a grid to X or a G to X analogy here, and that possibly could be a useful addition. Apart from that, you spoke about decentralized energy, etc. I remember long back, some years ago, when I used to operate in the energy access space, there were a lot of discussions around how microgrid operators could actually act as the last mile franchisee for distribution companies, reducing infra costs, and and there were some guidelines also that were issued, if I remember right. The Act amendment does talk about sub-licensing and franchisee models being allowed. Not sure if that applies to some of the integration of microgrid operators, etc. So maybe some clarity around that could help, just make that whole rural electricity infrastructure a lot more robust. And last 2 points, I think one, overall, I do feel that there could be a lot more. We've spoken a lot about regulators being reactive. I think this could be an opportunity for us to actually look at how do you make regulators more proactive and a lot more in sync with some of the developments that keep happening in the sector. And lastly, on the ECEA, right, I feel that the idea of a centralized grievance body seems to me going back in time. I think it would have been better had we looked at possibly regional benches of the ECA, because the whole point of accelerating some of the grievance redressal is to be able to do it with lower costs and in quicker time. So if you're going to have it in Delhi and expect everybody to come down there to look at to tackle their disputes, I feel that it will only keep pushing the idea of transitions, etc. And maybe could eventually lead to just being lip service and not really boost the sentiments of renewable developers, etc. So I'll just stop there. Thanks.
Thank you, Rahul. You had a point.
Well, just a question based on Disha's and general remarks. You said we need some improvements in our targets, and part of me thinks we actually don't want targets. We want frameworks, because right now you're now saying, well, I want to up my hydro, so therefore let's mandate some amount of hydro, RPOs, hydro generation mandates. So everything seems to be target oriented instead of just setting the signaling right so that we could unleash all these technologies, innovations, things that make sense for folks. If you need subsidies or support because the signaling doesn't work for certain users, so be it, then you use different instruments to handle that. But I'm very wary of top-down, target-oriented, and these amendments actually seem to reinforce the central and top-down view.
Abhishek, can I respond to?
Yes, please.
Yeah, hi, this is Kanika. So actually, Rahul, if I can just also building on what Disha said, I think that the idea is really from at least from our point of view, we think that the proposed amendments are quite renewables friendly, but renewables of sort of 2015 and 16. And this goes to the point that Aditya was just making about maybe for the most part, utility scale renewables are not they don't need the kind of support that is currently being extended to them, but we need to think a bit more about transition. Actually goes to your point around what happens with the ones, you have more disruption, as we're seeing, with round the clock, with battery storage, with electric mobility as that comes in. So actually the recommendations that Disha outlined, which are missing from what has been proposed, are actually very similar to what you're saying around frameworks, but also around institutional structures that can hold everyone accountable. There's a little bit of slipping through the cracks that keeps happening, and it's because of the power sector has so many different players that there is a lot of buck passing. And the good things, as Kushagra said, is actually the proposal where there is new entities that are being proposed for implementation of contracts, but then again there is the flaw of kind of everything is tariff related. So what is really going to be the space for this new entity? But also other commentary that the amendments provide on institutional matters, such as references to the tariff policy, to the electricity, to the renewable energy policy, and makes them kind of binding. So I don't actually think that we're suggesting that there should be more enshrinement of actual numbers in the policy, but what it does is actually adds legitimacy to just general comments or announcements that are being made, but without any clear plan. So what we're actually suggesting is that there should be more meat on the bones in terms of institutional structure, and whether that number is 450 gigawatts of renewables and hydro now being classified or not is is less relevant than the structure required to actually keep going, rather than just thinking about the short term and the 175 gigawatt target.
Thank you, Kanika. Thank you for those very sharp
Abhishek, I
comments.
can just add a few points over here.
I will just
On the RE energy.
Yeah.
See, basically, as of at this stage, we can't provide details in the act itself. There would be certainly policy would be coming out from the central government in relation to renewable energies, and for that there's already a ground created under section 176. So if we see the amendment in 176, there's already provision for the policy with respect to amendment made in section 3A. And with respect to compliance perspective, if you see, there's a new amendment made to section 142 where the penalties has been increased. So if you don't comply with the RPO obligation like the earlier one, when there were not that much monetary obligations, now there's a lot of obligations on it. And thirdly, on the contract authority, there has been proposals that there would be benches of this authority around India. It may not be centralized permanently in Delhi. For initial point, it will start in Delhi, but gradually it will shift to other parts of India. Thank you.
Abhishek, you're on mute again.
I'm going to use the moderator's power to fuse the last two sessions because we're already out of time. The last thing that we thought was for the last comments, but we had a session on consumer rights. So let's hear from, and we have two speakers. One is Simran himself, who's worked a lot on the consumer side, but there's also Mr. Vishnu Rao. So quick comments, and then in that sequence, we'll close with the last comments. So yeah. Mr. Vishnu Rao, floor is yours.
Hi, Vishnu here. I represent the Citizen Consumer and Civic Action Group. I work as a senior researcher. So I will be wearing a slightly consumer activist hat, so to speak, because I think this is a very knee-jerk amendment, because Electricity Act 2003 considers both the interests of the consumer as well as the utilities interest. But the one fundamental difference is the social policy aspect of the amendment is not brought out. What are the social policy we are driving to aim at? What is it that we are trying to achieve through this other than contractual implementation or tariff increase or tariff rationalization, so to speak? So, or removal of regulatory assets. I think the one role of the regulator which is kind of not brought out is within the state government. Of course, the political economy of social policy lies with the state governments. But if you really go through the regulatory orders, at least in Tamil Nadu, you see that regulators have been drivers of social policy in the power sector. That is, I think, that is a recognition that we need to give, that regulators, not only the state governments, but the regulators themselves are drivers of social policy, and that should continue to happen given our social and economic situation of our country where we are at now. I think, having said that, what I think one particular instance, a very, very small instance of how a regulator will act. So I think Mr. Raja can chip in because he's in the know of these things. So the in Tamil Nadu, the political economy is that the agriculture has been given free power, and then you have a whole regulatory space having to dictate that whole definition of what agricultural sector should be. So 1978, you have the elections here coming up, and agricultural sector was kind of taken off from the thing and said, okay, now you guys have.
I think,
yeah, I'm sorry, I just got cut off. So the definition of agriculture was essentially removed from the records, so to speak. So then what happened is that the regulator has to then define the role and space of agriculture. So agriculture is subsidized. So it's a very, very tricky situation, but a social situation also. So one instance I'll give you, it's the situation of a chicken farmer, a poultry farmer. he's coming to a regulator and saying, I'm a poor man. I've got 50 chicken in my coop, in my yard. I need to have a bulb running all the time so that I'll be in a position so they'll lay eggs and I'll get some revenue out of it. So in this situation, he says, okay, I have these electricity enforcement squads coming in and saying you're putting one more bulb. So I'm unable to justify to them this is to improve my social situation and my economic condition. So can you grant me the provision under your subsidy regime to give me provision for one more bulb to be added? So this is so the regulator has to play this balancing role. The interest of, so to speak, consumer. No, it's not the consumer. The social and economic conditions of an electricity consumer, and what the Tamil Nadu Regulatory Commission did. Okay, fine. Oh, you have a problem. I understand that you need to have from 5,000 rupees. You need to increase your revenue to 10,000 rupees per month. Okay, have one more, but none of you kind of have considered. So we will consider this request and add it in the tariff order. So this is one situation. So let us say you have a poultry farmer, like 10,000 poultry farmers have benefited from this particular order, so to speak. So then what happens to the entire thing? So you have, over the years, you have regulators promulgating social policies after social policies. You have, NGOs serving poor people. You have charitable hospitals requiring, who are not. So a lot of these situations keep coming in, and then it is shown as a subsidy burden to the state government on record. So I think this is something that the regulatory, the amendment, or has not captured the social element of this whole thing. And this is something that we need to recognize, and also on balance with the contracts. So because contractual positions are mainly to do with timely filing of ARR, lack of regulatory interventions in as Mr. Rajas correctly pointed out.
Mr. Rao, I mean, point absolutely well taken, though I would like to be slightly provocative and we can have this discussion offline. I would say there is too much of social representation, but not in the sense that you mean, which has been basically the reason why we have such a distorted cross-subsidy regime, because there are political interests with a certain kind of societal setup. Anyway, one more point from the consumer side. I think this is a very important dimension. There are standards of performances well articulated by regulators, and but there does not seem to be adequate awareness about those standards of performances. There are a number of issues. Simran's organization, Bas Research Foundation, has been doing excellent work. Simran, would you just come in and close the consumer dimension on it before?
Let me just add a couple of points, and I think can close it. I think the idea then is 2 points alone, so I'll close this from my side. I think the other point is again the idea of tariff rationalization and cost-effective tariff, and the removal of regulatory assets. I think from my viewpoint, regulatory assets are a necessary sectoral standard that we need to think about, because we are all locked into the network. I think we have to pay a rent to the network generations up to generation, whether it is now or the future. So there is I don't understand the need to recoup costs immediately as soon as the investment is made. Secondly, in terms of sub-distribution licensee and franchisee, I understand there is this whole element of wanting to promote this competitive environment, but the role of cherry picking in sub-distribution licensee is something that has already been said several times. In terms of franchisee, I can understand billing, etc., can be franchisee models that will be taken out of the distribution sector. But again, the contractual conditions of franchisee models. Last one is the contract enforcement authority. So I think one thing that we need to understand is, from a consumer perspective, what will be the role of the judicial member in the SCRC? I think 3/4 of cases that come out of the SCRC are basically contract-related cases. Again, the quality of regulator that is kind of needed to be strengthened. So that is something that we need to think about. And finally, I think one section that has not been used in the Electricity Act is basically Section 60, market domination. So you have positions in the Electricity Act where rooftop solar is being promoted by the state government, but since the sale of power is equal to revenue, that particular bit of so the domination of the state utilities is very stark. So they shut out the market at the tendering, at the distribution of net meters, where the whole control over net meters is given to the distribution licensee. So that is one bit. I think the last point where you talked about mandating distribution standards of performance is absolutely right. I think there are a couple of points that also need to be added for this thing. You have a smart grid, smart metering system, you have data privacy, theft of power, etc. So those are points that need to have a lot of sense, need to be strengthened, of course. But distribution standards of performance need to have within the tariff order also. That is not
Vishnuji, we are coming back to the same thing that we discussed, which is again Discom's cross subsidy. I understand all these points are very, they're all linked to each other. Let me just invite the last comments. I'm sorry, we're just running out of time. We would welcome any offline comments that you would want to give.
No, I'm done. That's okay.
Yeah. So Vivek Sen is with us from Shakti Foundation, and Simran, then you can end the discussion with your comments. Mr. Sen? I think Vivek has left, has it?
I don't think Vivek joined.
Okay, Vivek then joined. So Simran, floor is all yours, and you can.
Thank you, Abhishek. First of all, let's acknowledge two facts. One, the proposed amendments do not deal directly with consumer rights and consumer interests. And to say that there has been no learning since 2003 to require reflection on consumer-specific clauses is either outrageously arrogant or inconsiderate towards consumer interests. Secondly, as a co-host, I must apologize that even in this discussion, the topic of consumer interest got pushed towards the end. Just indicates how our general perception is towards consumers as an equal stakeholders. Abhishek, you can say.
Simran,
I understand the limitations of time.
Let me register my point, my rejoinder quickly. The reason, there are two things that we've learned from this discussion. One was actually the Discom should have been the first part of the discussion and consumer should be the last part, because consumer must understand everything. So you have the floor. Please intervene on the consumer point.
Thank you. Back to the proposed amendments. I think first of all, it's time for the Electricity Act to define 24/7 access to affordable and reliable access to electricity as a right, and which, despite the political mandates, we fail to see this in the proposed amendment. There are a number of issues which we have experienced on the ground from our experience in terms of interpretations and provisions of the Act's original Act concerning consumers. Just to highlight, if I talk about, there's a significant ambiguity between Section 126 and 135 of the Act, which deal with unauthorized use of power and theft of power. The grievance redressal provisions between the two are very different. The penalties and the punitive actions between the two are very different. And often officers on the ground take that advantage of the ambiguity and corner poor and uninformed consumers. Again, as you highlighted, standards of performance, I think the interpretation of tariff policy and standard of performance and supply code does not hold up to international best standards. That being said, there's a humongous disparity, regional disparity between urban and rural compliance and standard of performance. We see compliance, which is the weighted average across the distribution circle, and the numbers may seem okay, but if you go on the ground, there's a huge disparity between the quality of services between an urban and semi-urban and rural sectors.
Thank you, Simran. Thank you, everybody. I think we have a lot of points discussed. What we're going to do, and to answer Rahul, your point as well, we will record this information, analyze this information, and also circulate amongst you all just to verify the accuracy and also some other comments that you may have regarding these issues. One last point to sum it up, I'm very, very curious, maybe we can have some offline discussion, is that, again, this question that we asked, that the timing of these amendments and the times that we are living in currently is very, very important. And I think we need to think a little bit more on that, because what we really need is to kickstart the economy. We need to go hyper local. That means cost of power has to be cheaper. The cost of supply is expensive. Let us deliberate on how we can get it. Are there measures we can reduce the cost? Is there renewable integration? What is the future of DRE? These are still open questions that we could not answer in today's discussion, but we look forward to, with this discussion as a base, to sort of deepen that discussion as well. And lastly, what kind of implication these proposed amendments could possibly have in the political economy of India and central state relations. So I think these are two open questions, and we will continue to research and deliberate upon these questions. Once again, thank you very much for joining us. It has been very, very nice of all of you to have given us such great inputs. We'll keep you posted on next steps. Thank you.